The bullet grazed so close to Eleanor Langford's ear that she felt the heat before she heard the crack. And in that single heartbeat between life and death, she realized her silence might be the only thing that saved her from screaming and giving away her hiding spot behind the overturned wagon. It was August 1876 in Quartzsite, Arizona Territory, and the desert sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty Main Street where three outlaws had decided to rob the general store at high noon. Eleanor had been inside purchasing thread when the shooting started, and she had dropped to the floor instantly, her heart hammering in her chest as she crawled toward the back door. The scarlet fever had taken her voice 6 months earlier, leaving her throat scarred and her vocal cords damaged beyond repair, but her survival instincts remained sharp as ever. She pressed herself against the rough wooden planks of the wagon, her blue cotton dress already dusty and torn at the hem. The outlaws were shouting at the shopkeeper, demanding money and supplies. Eleanor could hear the terror in the old man's voice as he complied, his words shaking and stumbling over each other. She wanted to help, but what could a voiceless woman do against armed criminals? The sound of hoofbeats thundered down the street, and suddenly the air exploded with more gunfire. Eleanor covered her head with her arms, making herself as small as possible. Through the gap beneath the wagon, she could see boots hitting the ground, spurs jingling as someone moved with purpose and confidence. The newcomers were engaging the outlaws, and the fight was fierce but brief. When the silence finally came, it was punctuated only by the groaning of wounded men and the nervous whinnying of horses. Eleanor remained frozen, unsure if it was safe to emerge. Then a pair of worn brown boots appeared in her line of sight, and a voice called out, gentle but concerned. "Anyone hiding back here? The danger has passed. You are safe now." Eleanor slowly uncurled herself and peered up from behind the wagon. The man standing before her was tall, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly beneath his hat. His green eyes were kind despite the gun still holstered at his hip, and he held out a hand to help her up. She could see the deputy's badge pinned to his vest. She took his hand and stood, brushing the dust from her dress. He looked at her expectantly, waiting for her to speak, to thank him or tell him if she was hurt. Eleanor opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She had learned in the months since losing her voice that this moment always brought confusion, then pity, and sometimes even suspicion. She pointed to her throat and shook her head, hoping he would understand. The deputy's expression shifted, but not to pity as she had expected. Instead, his eyes softened with understanding. "You cannot speak," he said simply, not as a question but as an observation. "Were you hurt in the shooting?" Eleanor shook her head and gestured to herself, then made a motion as if she had been sick. She touched her throat again. "You lost your voice to illness," he said, watching her carefully. She nodded, grateful that he seemed to comprehend. "Well, miss, that does not matter one bit. Your eyes say everything I need. I can see you are frightened but unharmed, and that is what is important." Something in Eleanor's chest loosened at those words. She had spent half a year feeling invisible, with people talking over her or about her as if she was not there. But this man looked directly at her, really seeing her, and treated her silence not as a disability but simply as a different way of being. "I am Deputy Harrison Oakes," he said, tipping his hat to her. "Might I escort you somewhere safe while we round up these outlaws?" Eleanor nodded and allowed him to guide her away from the chaos. The sheriff and another deputy were binding the surviving outlaw's hands, while the town doctor was being summoned for the wounded. Harrison led Eleanor to the small restaurant across the street, where the owner, Mrs. Chen, was peeking out nervously from behind her curtains. "Mrs. Chen, this young lady needs a safe place to sit for a moment," Harrison said. Might she wait inside while we finish up?" The elderly Chinese woman nodded quickly and ushered Eleanor inside, chattering about the terrible violence and how the town was not what it used to be. Eleanor had always liked Mrs. Chen, who had never treated her differently after the scarlet fever. The woman brought her tea without being asked and patted her hand kindly. Through the window, Eleanor watched Harrison work. He moved with efficiency and competence, checking on the shopkeeper, speaking to witnesses, and helping to load the outlaws into the jail wagon. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 25 or 26, and there was something steady about him that made her feel safe. She was 22 years old and had lived in Quartzsite for 3 years, ever since her father had died and left her his small house on the edge of town. Before the fever, she had worked as a teacher at the local schoolhouse, but after losing her voice, the school board had decided she could no longer fulfill her duties. Now she took in sewing and mending, making just enough to survive. An hour passed before Harrison returned to the restaurant. He removed his hat as he entered and approached Eleanor's table. "May I sit?" he asked. She nodded, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "I realize I never got your name," he said, settling into the seat, "though I suppose you cannot tell me in the traditional manner." Eleanor had carried a small journal and pencil in her reticule for months now, essential tools for communication. She pulled them out and wrote carefully, "Eleanor Langford, thank you for your help today." Harrison read the words and smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "Miss Langford, the pleasure is mine. I am only glad I arrived when I did. Those men had been causing trouble up in Prescott, and we had word they were heading this way." She wrote again, "You saved lives today." "Just doing my job," he said, but she could see he was pleased by the acknowledgement. "Have you lived in Quartzsite long?" Eleanor found herself writing more than she had intended, explaining about her father and the house and her work as a seamstress. Harrison listened attentively, reading each word carefully and asking follow-up questions that showed he was genuinely interested. It was the longest conversation she had managed to have with anyone in months, even if only one of them was speaking aloud. "My father was the sheriff here for 20 years, Harrison told her. "He died last spring, and I took over his position as deputy. Been learning the ropes from Sheriff Daniels ever since." "I am sorry for your loss," Eleanor wrote. "Thank you. He was a good man, taught me everything about being fair and protecting people who cannot protect themselves." Harrison paused, then added, "You know, Miss Langford, I have been thinking. A woman living alone on the edge of town, especially one who cannot call for help if trouble arises, that concerns me. Would you allow me to check on you from time to time, just to ensure you are safe?" Eleanor felt her heart skip. Was he truly concerned, or was this pity disguised as duty? She studied his face, looking for any sign of condescension, but found only honest worry. She wrote, "I would not want to be a burden." "A burden?" Harrison shook his head firmly. "Miss Langford, ensuring the safety of Quartzsite citizens is exactly what I am supposed to do. And I confess, I would rest easier knowing you are all right. This town can be rough, and today proved that danger can arrive without warning." She considered this, then nodded slowly. It would be nice to have someone check on her, and if she was honest with herself, there was something about Harrison Oaks that made her want to see him again. "Excellent," he said, standing and replacing his hat. "I will stop by tomorrow evening if that suits you, just to make sure everything is secure." Eleanor wrote her address and handed him the paper. He tucked it carefully into his vest pocket and tipped his hat to her once more before heading back out into the bright afternoon sun. Mrs. Chen appeared at Eleanor's elbow, her eyes twinkling. "That deputy is a good man," she said in her accented English. "And he looks at you like you are something special, not something broken." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she could not deny the small flutter of hope in her chest. For the first time since losing her voice, someone had looked at her and seen a whole person, not just a disability. Harrison had said her eyes told him everything he needed, and somehow she believed he meant it. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Eleanor tried to focus on her sewing work, hemming a dress for the banker's wife and mending tears in workmen's shirts, but her mind kept wandering to the promised visit. She told herself it was foolish to read anything romantic into Harrison's concern. He was a lawman doing his duty, nothing more. Still, she found herself tidying her small house more thoroughly than usual, sweeping the floors and dusting the furniture. She changed into her better dress, a green calico that matched her eyes, then felt ridiculous and changed back into her everyday blue cotton. Then she changed again. By the time evening arrived, she had worked herself into a state of nervous anticipation. The knock came just as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Eleanor smoothed her dress, the green calico she had finally settled on, and opened the door. Harrison stood on her small porch, hat in hand, looking slightly nervous himself. "Good evening, Miss Langford," he said. "I hope I am not calling at an inconvenient time." She shook her head and stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. He walked through her small parlor, his eyes taking in the modest but neat space. She had made curtains for the windows and a quilt that hung on the wall, both in cheerful patterns that brightened the room. "You have a lovely home," Harrison said. "Did you make these?" He gestured to the quilt. Eleanor nodded, pleased he had noticed. "You are very talented. My mother used to quilt before she passed. She would have admired your work." Eleanor pulled out her journal. "May I offer you coffee? That would be very kind, thank you." She moved into the small kitchen and prepared the coffee, aware of Harrison's presence in her doorway. He was not hovering or watching her suspiciously as some men might have. Instead, he seemed content to wait patiently, occasionally glancing around at the details of her home. When the coffee was ready, they sat at her small table. The conversation flowed more easily than Eleanor would have thought possible, given that she could only write responses. Harrison told her about his day, about a dispute between two ranchers over water rights and a lost child who had been found safe. He asked about her sewing work and whether she enjoyed it. "I miss teaching," Eleanor wrote honestly, "but I am grateful to have work at all." "You were a teacher." Harrison leaned forward with interest. "What did you teach?" "Everything. Reading, writing, arithmetic, history. I loved it." "Why did you have to stop? Surely being unable to speak does not mean you cannot teach." Eleanor felt a familiar bitterness rise up. "The school board said children need a teacher who can speak properly. They said I would not be able to maintain order or read aloud or call for help in an emergency." "That seems short-sighted," Harrison said, his jaw tightening. "I had a teacher once who was hard of hearing. Mr. Peters. He was the best educator I ever had because he paid attention in ways others did not. He watched us closely, learned how we communicated without words. He taught us that there is more than one way to convey information." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. No one had ever suggested that her inability to speak might not be an insurmountable obstacle. Everyone else had simply accepted the school board's decision as reasonable. "I am sorry," Harrison said softly. "I did not mean to upset you." She shook her head and wrote, "You did not upset me. You gave me something I have not had in a long time. Hope." Harrison reached across the table and gently covered her hand with his own. The touch was brief but warm, and Eleanor felt it like a spark of electricity. "Miss Langford, Eleanor, may I call you Eleanor?" She nodded. "Eleanor, I meant what I said yesterday. Your eyes tell me everything I need. I can see your intelligence, your strength, your kindness. I can see the sadness of loss and the determination to persevere. You do not need a voice for me to understand who you are." Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she wrote, "You barely know me." "That is true," Harrison acknowledged, "but I would like to know you better if you would permit it. Not out of pity or duty, but because I find you fascinating and I would very much like to spend more time in your company." "Are you courting me, Deputy Oakes?" Harrison's ears turned slightly red, but he met her gaze steadily. "I suppose I am, if you would allow it. I know this is sudden, and I am not usually so forward, but life is short and uncertain. Today's shooting reminded me of that. When you see something worth pursuing, you should not waste time." Eleanor's heart was racing. She had not expected this, had not dared to hope for it. Since losing her voice, she had assumed romance was no longer a possibility for her. What man would want a wife who could not speak? But Harrison was looking at her with such sincerity that she could not doubt his intentions. She wrote carefully, "I would like that very much. But you should know what you are agreeing to. I will never speak again. The doctors were clear about that." "I heard you the first time," Harrison said with a slight smile. "And I told you it does not matter to me. Communication is not just about words, Eleanor. It is about truly hearing what someone is trying to say. I think I can do that with you." They talked until the stars came out, and when Harrison finally left, promising to return the next evening, Eleanor floated through the rest of her night in a daze of happiness. She had not felt this light in months, maybe years. True to his word, Harrison came by the next evening and the one after that. Within a week, it had become their routine. He would finish his deputy duties and come to her house for coffee and conversation. They would sit at her small table or on the porch if the weather was pleasant, and they would share the details of their days. Harrison was easy to talk to, patient with her writing, and genuinely interested in her thoughts on everything from town politics to the best way to can peaches. He brought her books from his small collection at home, knowing she loved to read. She mended his shirts and sewed new buttons on his vest, taking pleasure in the small acts of care. The town began to notice, of course. Quartzsite was too small for anything to remain private for long. Eleanor could see the curious glances when she walked down the main street, the whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. She tried not to let it bother her, but she knew what people were saying. What could the deputy possibly see in the mute seamstress, Mrs. Chen, however, was delighted. "I told you," she crowed when Eleanor came in for her weekly meal at the restaurant. "That man knows a treasure when he sees one." Even Sheriff Daniels, a gruff man in his 50s, seemed pleased by the development. He stopped Eleanor one day outside the general store and tipped his hat to her. "Miss Langford, I want you to know that Harrison has not been this happy in a long time. His father's death hit him hard and I worried about him, but you have brought light back to his eyes. Thank you for that." Eleanor did not know what to write in response, so she simply smiled and nodded. The sheriff seemed to understand and went on his way. 6 weeks into their courtship, Harrison took Eleanor on a proper outing. He borrowed a buggy and drove her out into the desert, away from the dusty streets and gossiping neighbors. They went in the late afternoon when the heat was beginning to ease and the sky was turning golden. He had packed a basket with bread, cheese, dried fruit, and lemonade. They spread a blanket near a cluster of saguaro cacti and watched the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. "I have been thinking," Harrison said as they ate, "about what you said about missing teaching." Eleanor looked at him curiously and waited for him to continue. "What if you opened a small school of your own? Just a few students, children whose parents understand that learning is about more than hearing a voice at the front of a classroom. You could teach reading and writing, the basics. I would help you." Eleanor felt her breath catch. Could such a thing be possible? She reached for her journal. Who would send their children to a teacher who cannot speak? I think you might be surprised, Harrison said. There are good people in this town who judge based on ability, not limitation. Mrs. Chen, for instance, and the Ramirez family. And old Tom Brennan, the blacksmith. He has 3 children and his wife passed 2 years ago. He has been struggling to give them proper schooling. But what about maintaining order? Reading aloud. You can maintain order with presence and clear expectations. As for reading aloud, you could have the children read to each other. That would improve their skills even more than listening to a teacher. Eleanor wanted to believe him, but fear held her back. What if she tried and failed? What if the parents complained? What if she proved the school board right? Harrison seemed to sense her hesitation. He reached out and took both her hands in his. Eleanor, I have watched you over these past weeks. You are one of the strongest people I know. You lost something precious, and instead of giving up, you found new ways to live and work and communicate. That takes courage. I know you have enough courage for this too. His faith in her was intoxicating. Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. In his eyes, she saw not pity but genuine belief. He thought she could do this. I would need time to prepare, she wrote with one hand, unwilling to fully release his grip, and a space to teach. You could use your parlor for now, just a handful of students. If it works out, we could find a larger space later. Harrison's smile was growing. Is that a yes? Eleanor took a deep breath and nodded. Yes. Harrison let out a whoop of joy that startled a roadrunner from the nearby brush. Then more tentatively, he leaned forward. May I kiss you, Eleanor? Her heart hammering, Eleanor nodded again. His lips met hers gently, reverently, as if she were something precious. The kiss was sweet and full of promise, and when they pulled apart, Eleanor felt dizzy with happiness. The evening deepened around them, the sky turning from gold to pink to purple. They sat close together on the blanket, Harrison's arm around her shoulders, and talked about the future. It was the first time since losing her voice that Eleanor truly believed she might have won. The next week was a flurry of activity. Harrison helped Eleanor rearrange her parlor to accommodate desks, which they borrowed from the closed-up old schoolhouse. He spread the word quietly among families he thought might be interested. To Eleanor's surprise and delight, 5 families expressed interest. Tom Brennan brought his 3 children personally to meet her, his weathered face kind. My young ones need learning, he said. I do not care if you can talk or not, Miss Langford. Harrison says you are smart and patient, and that is what matters. The Ramirez family had twin girls, 7 years old, who were bright-eyed and curious. Mrs. Ramirez spoke limited English but made it clear through gestures, and her daughter translating that she trusted Eleanor. Eleanor prepared lessons with care, designing activities that would work despite her silence. She created cards with instructions written clearly. She would demonstrate what she wanted the children to do. She would have them practice reading aloud to each other while she circulated and helped with difficult words. On the first day of her small school, Eleanor's hands shook as she opened the door to her students. The 5 children filed in, ranging from 6 to 10 years old, looking around with interest. Tom Brennan's oldest, a girl named Sarah, gave Eleanor a shy smile. Eleanor had written a welcome message on her chalkboard, which Harrison had hung on her wall. The children read it aloud together, sounding out the words. Then Eleanor began her first lesson, teaching them to introduce themselves in writing. The hours flew by. The children were attentive and enthusiastic, and Eleanor found that Harrison had been right. She did not need a voice to maintain order. A look, a gesture, a written note, all sufficed. By the time the parents came to collect their children, Eleanor was exhausted but exhilarated. How did it go? Harrison asked when he stopped by that evening, as had become his habit. Eleanor's hand flew across the page of her journal. It was wonderful. The children were so eager to learn. I felt like myself again. Harrison pulled her into a hug, and she allowed herself to melt into his embrace. "I knew you could do it," he murmured into her hair. "I am so proud of you." As the weeks passed, Eleanor's little school thrived. The children made progress, and word began to spread. 2 more families asked if their children could attend. Eleanor had to limit her enrollment, as her parlor could only hold so many desks, but she was overjoyed by the demand. Her relationship with Harrison deepened too. He was a constant presence in her life, steady and supportive. They spent their evenings together, either at her house or occasionally at his small cabin on the other side of town. He would read aloud to her, his voice warm and expressive, bringing stories to life. She would listen, her head on his shoulder, feeling a contentment she had never known before. One October evening, 3 months after their first meeting, Harrison arrived at her door looking unusually nervous. He held a small box in his hands, and Eleanor's heart began to race before he even opened it. "Eleanor," he said, then paused and took a breath. "I had a whole speech prepared, but looking at you now, I find the words escaping me, so I will make this simple. I love you. I love your strength, your kindness, your intelligence, and your beautiful eyes that tell me everything I need to know. I want to spend the rest of my life with you, learning all the ways we can communicate, building a home together. Will you marry me?" He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone, the blue-green color of the Arizona sky. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She nodded emphatically, then grabbed her journal. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. I love you too, Harrison Oakes." Harrison slipped the ring onto her finger, then swept her into his arms, spinning her around her small parlor. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, and Eleanor felt as if her heart might burst from happiness. They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church at the edge of Quartzsite. Mrs. Chen decorated the pews with wildflowers she had cultivated in her garden. Tom Brennan and his children came, as did the Ramirez family and many of the other families whose children Eleanor taught. Sheriff Daniels stood as Harrison's witness, and Mrs. Chen stood as Eleanor's. The pastor, a young man named Reverend Matthews, had worked with Eleanor ahead of time to arrange a ceremony that accommodated her silence. When it came time for her vows, she handed him a paper on which she had written her promises. He read them aloud on her behalf. "I, Eleanor Langford, take you, Harrison Oakes, to be my husband. I promise to love you in silence and in gesture, in writing and in glances, in all the ways my heart knows how to speak even though my voice cannot. I promise to stand by you in trouble and in triumph, to build a life with you full of meaning and purpose, to be your partner in all things. This I vow before God and these witnesses." Harrison's own vows were spoken with a voice thick with emotion. "I, Harrison Oakes, take you, Eleanor Langford, to be my wife. I promise to always listen to what you are saying, even when you do not speak. I promise to see you for who you truly are, to honor your strength, to support your dreams. I promise that your voice will never be missing from our home, because I will always be listening with my whole heart. This I vow before God and these witnesses." When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Harrison kissed Eleanor with such tenderness that several people in attendance wiped away tears. The celebration afterward was held at Mrs. Chen's restaurant, which she had closed to the public for the occasion. She served a feast of her best dishes, and the small gathering of friends laughed and ate and toasted the new couple's happiness. As the evening wore on and the guests began to depart, Harrison leaned close to Eleanor. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Oakes?" The name sent a thrill through her. She nodded, and they walked hand in hand through the darkened streets to Harrison's cabin, which was to be their home. It was larger than Eleanor's house, with 2 bedrooms and a proper kitchen. Harrison had spent the past weeks fixing it up, repairing the roof and painting the walls and building new shelves for Eleanor's books and sewing supplies. He carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing at the traditional gesture. Then they were alone, truly alone as husband and wife for the first time. Eleanor felt nervous, but Harrison's gentle presence soothed her. He took his time, asking permission with his eyes before each touch, each kiss. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, a physical conversation that needed no words. In the months that followed, Eleanor and Harrison settled into married life with ease. She continued teaching her small school, now operating out of a larger room that Tom Brennan had helped Harrison build onto the back of their cabin. Harrison continued his work as deputy, keeping Quartzsite safe and peaceful. They developed their own language of gestures and expressions. Harrison learned to read the subtle changes in Eleanor's face that indicated her moods. A slight crinkle around her eyes meant amusement. A tightening of her jaw meant frustration. A soft look meant love, which she gave him frequently. Eleanor, in turn, learned that Harrison hummed tunelessly when he was thinking hard about a problem, that he unconsciously touched his father's old pocket watch when he missed his parents, that he always brought her wildflowers when he had been gone all day and missed her. Their home was filled with laughter, communicated through Harrison's voice and Eleanor's silent mirth, her shoulders shaking and her eyes sparkling. They entertained friends regularly. Mrs. Chen became a frequent dinner guest, as did Sheriff Daniels, who had come to regard them both with grandfatherly affection. A year into their marriage, Eleanor realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had wanted to be certain before telling Harrison. When the doctor confirmed it, she rushed home and wrote the news on the chalkboard in their kitchen, the same chalkboard she used for teaching. Harrison came home to find her standing nervously beside it, watching him. He read the words, "You are going to be a father," and his face went through a series of expressions so rapidly that Eleanor almost laughed. Shock, disbelief, then pure joy. "Truly?" he asked, crossing the room to her in 3 long strides. She nodded, and he picked her up and spun her, just as he had when she accepted his proposal. "We are going to be parents," he said wonderingly. "Eleanor, this is the best news I could have imagined." They spent the evening making plans, talking about names and whether to convert the spare room into a nursery, and how Harrison would need to build a cradle. Eleanor wrote furiously in her journal, sharing all her hopes and fears. Harrison listened to it all, reassuring her when she worried about how she would care for a baby when she could not soothe it with lullabies or call out warnings. "Our child will know love," Harrison said firmly. "That is what matters." And children learn to communicate with their parents in all sorts of ways. Ours will simply learn that their mother's love is shown through actions and expressions and written words. They will never doubt they are cherished. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Eleanor continued teaching through her 6th month, then reluctantly took a break as her belly grew too large for her to move comfortably between the desks. The families were understanding, and several mothers came by to check on her and bring food. In April of 1878, Eleanor went into labor. Harrison rode frantically to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Potter, an experienced woman who had delivered half the babies in Quartzsite. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Harrison paced outside the bedroom door, terrified by the silence within. Eleanor could not cry out in pain, could not tell them if something was wrong. But Mrs. Potter was skilled, and she watched Eleanor's face and body carefully, understanding the unspoken communication. Finally, after 18 hours, their son was born. He came into the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to Harrison's eyes. Mrs. Potter cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft blanket before placing him in Eleanor's arms. She looked down at the tiny face, the squinting eyes and rosebud mouth, and felt love crash over her like a wave. This was her son, hers and Harrison's. He was perfect. Harrison sat beside her on the bed, his arm around her shoulders, staring at their child with wonder. "He is beautiful," he whispered. "Just like his mother. What should we name him?" They had discussed names endlessly, but now that Eleanor was looking at her son, only one name felt right. She caught Harrison's eye and mouthed the word, forming it carefully so he could read her lips. "Henry." "Henry," Harrison repeated, testing the sound. "Henry Oakes, I like it. Hello, Henry." "Welcome to the world, son." Henry's first weeks were challenging. Eleanor had worried about how she would manage without being able to vocally soothe her son, but she found other ways. She learned that he responded to the vibrations when she hummed, even though no sound emerged. She could press her hand to her chest and create a low rumble that seemed to calm him. She rocked him constantly, held him close, let him feel the steady beat of her heart. Harrison was an attentive father, waking for night feedings and changing diapers without complaint. He would talk to Henry constantly, telling him stories about his day, about his own childhood, about the brave woman who was his mother. "Your mama lost her voice to a terrible illness," Harrison told Henry one evening as Eleanor watched from the doorway. "But she never lost her spirit. She is the strongest person I know, and you are lucky to have her. She will teach you that there are many ways to communicate, many ways to show love. She will teach you to listen with more than your ears, to understand with your whole heart." Eleanor felt tears slide down her cheeks at these words. She had worried that her inability to speak would somehow diminish her as a mother, but Harrison's faith in her never wavered. As Henry grew, he thrived. By 6 months, he was a chubby, happy baby who smiled readily at both his parents. Eleanor noticed that he watched her face intently, learning to read her expressions. He understood her gestures even at that young age, turning his head when she pointed or reaching for her when she opened her arms. When Henry was 8 months old, Eleanor returned to teaching part-time. She brought Henry with her, placing him in a crib in the corner of the schoolroom. The children were enchanted by the baby and were very good about keeping their voices down during his naps. They learned to include him in their activities as he got older, showing him picture books and singing songs to him. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Harrison was promoted to sheriff when Sheriff Daniels retired, a position he took seriously but handled with grace. He was respected in Quartzsite, known for his fairness and integrity. Eleanor's school continued to grow in reputation, and she eventually had a waiting list of families hoping to enroll their children. When Henry was 2 years old, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again. This time she was less nervous, more confident in her ability to mother. Their daughter was born in September of 1880, a squalling, red-faced girl with a full head of dark hair. They named her Alice, after Harrison's mother. She was a different baby than Henry had been, more demanding and energetic. But Eleanor adapted, learning Alice's particular rhythms and needs just as she had with Henry. The years flowed by, marked by the milestones of their children's growth. Henry's first words, which included "Mama," spoken while looking directly at Eleanor, even though she could not respond in kind. Alice's first steps, taken toward Eleanor's open arms. Birthday celebrations and holiday gatherings and lazy Sunday afternoons. Eleanor's teaching evolved over time. As her reputation spread, she began to receive requests from other towns to share her methods. With Harrison's encouragement, she wrote a book about her teaching philosophy and techniques, about how education could be adapted to different circumstances. A publisher in San Francisco took interest, and her book was printed in 1883. The publication brought attention from educators across the country. Some were skeptical, but many were intrigued by her methods. Eleanor began to receive letters from teachers who worked with students who were deaf or mute, asking for advice. She answered each one carefully, sharing what she had learned. Through it all, Harrison remained her steadfast supporter. He read her writings and offered suggestions. He handled the correspondence with publishers when her hand cramped from too much writing. He took care of the children when she needed to focus. He told her daily, in words and actions, how proud he was of her accomplishments. Their love deepened with each passing year, becoming something richer and more complex than the initial attraction had been. They had weathered difficulties together. A severe drought that threatened the town's water supply, a bout of influenza that swept through and took several lives, including Mrs. Chen, whom they both mourned deeply. They had celebrated triumphs. Harrison successfully mediating a conflict that could have erupted into violence between settlers and the nearby Yavapai people. Eleanor's school producing graduates who went on to become teachers themselves. Through it all, they had each other. Every night, they would sit together after the children were in bed and share the details of their day. Harrison would talk about his work, and Eleanor would write in her journal or use the sign language they had learned together, a mix of formal signs and their own private gestures. One evening in the spring of 1885, as they sat on their porch watching the sun set over the desert, Harrison took Eleanor's hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly. She looked at him questioningly, and he clarified. "Not having your voice. You regret what you lost." Eleanor considered the question seriously. It had been 9 years since the scarlet fever, 9 years of silence. She would be lying if she said she never missed being able to speak, never longed to hear her own voice again. But would she trade the life she had built for the ability to talk? She pulled out the small notebook she always carried and wrote, "I regret the pain of losing my voice. I regret that my children will never hear me read to them or sing lullabies. But I do not regret the path it set me on, because that path led to you." Harrison read the words, and his eyes grew bright with unshed tears. "You led to me too," he said. "That day in the street when I saw you behind that wagon, when I looked into your eyes and saw your strength, that was the moment my life truly began." Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky fade from orange to purple to indigo. Henry and Alice's laughter drifted from inside the house, where they were playing some game before bedtime. This was her life now. Not the one she had imagined in her youth, when she had assumed she would be a traditional wife and mother, singing and chatting and calling out to her children. But a life that was no less full, no less meaningful. A life rich with love and purpose and connection. More years passed. Henry grew into a thoughtful boy, then a serious young man who decided to follow his father into law enforcement. Alice became a teacher like her mother, specializing in working with children who had various challenges. Both children had learned from their parents' example that limitations were simply opportunities to find new solutions. When Henry was 16 and Alice 14, Eleanor was surprised to find herself pregnant again. She was 40 years old and had assumed her childbearing days were behind her. But the doctor confirmed it, and Eleanor found herself both nervous and excited about starting over with a baby after so many years. This pregnancy was harder than the previous ones, her body older and less resilient. She had to stop teaching entirely in her 4th month and spent much of the pregnancy resting. Harrison fretted over her constantly, and their teenagers took on more responsibilities around the house. In January of 1886, Eleanor gave birth to twin boys. The labor was difficult, and there were moments when Harrison feared he might lose her. But Eleanor was strong, and she fought through. The twins were small but healthy, and they named them Thomas and William. The twins brought new energy and chaos to the household. At 16, Henry was old enough to be a real help, often carrying one baby while Harrison carried the other. Alice doted on her baby brothers, singing to them and rocking them when Eleanor was too exhausted. Harrison had gone gray at the temples by this point, but he approached fatherhood again with the same dedication he had shown with their first two children. He would walk the floor with crying babies at all hours, never complaining. He hired help for Eleanor, a young woman named Mary who came in daily to assist with household tasks. As the twins grew, Eleanor marveled at how different they were from each other despite sharing a womb. Thomas was calm and observant, while William was energetic and mischievous. Both boys, like their older siblings, learned to understand their mother's silent communication with ease. They seemed to have an intuitive grasp of what she was telling them, even when others might have been confused. Eleanor sometimes wondered what her life would have been like if she had never lost her voice. Would she have married someone else? Would she have remained a traditional school teacher, never innovating or expanding her methods? Would she have met Harrison at all? The questions were pointless, of course. The past could not be changed, but Eleanor found that she did not want to change it, even if she could. Yes, losing her voice had been traumatic and painful. Yes, there were still moments of frustration when she desperately wished she could simply speak. But that loss had shaped her into who she was, had brought her to Harrison, had given her a unique perspective that had helped countless children. As she approached her 50th birthday in 1893, Eleanor looked back on her life with satisfaction. Her children were all thriving. Henry had become a deputy like his father before him, and was courting a sweet girl named Emma. Alice was teaching at the official Quartzsite school, which had finally hired her despite initially rejecting Eleanor all those years ago. The twins were rambunctious 7-year-olds who kept everyone on their toes. Harrison was preparing to retire from his position as sheriff, ready to hand the responsibility to younger men. He still moved with purpose and strength, but there was gray in his beard now and lines around his eyes. To Eleanor, he was more handsome than ever. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Harrison took Eleanor back to the place where they had had their first picnic, that spot in the desert where he had encouraged her to open her school and where he had first kissed her. They left the twins with Alice and Henry and drove out in the late afternoon. Just as they had so many years before, Harrison had packed a basket with their favorite foods, and they spread a blanket among the saguaros. The desert had not changed much, though the cacti were taller and quartzsite had grown larger, but the essential character of the place remained the same. As they ate and watched the sunset, Harrison pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I have something for you," he said. Eleanor unwrapped it carefully to find a leather-bound journal, far more elegant than the simple notebooks she usually used. Her name was embossed on the cover in gold letters, Eleanor Langford Oakes. "For your memoirs," Harrison said. "I know you have been thinking about writing down your story, about losing your voice and finding your way forward. I think it is a story worth telling." Eleanor ran her fingers over the embossed letters. She had been thinking about writing her story, wondering if it might help others who faced similar challenges. But she had not mentioned it to Harrison. How had he known? He smiled at her expression. "Your eyes told me," he said. "They always do." Eleanor opened the journal to the first page, and found that Harrison had already written something there in his neat handwriting. To my beloved Eleanor, who taught me that the most important communication happens not with words but with the heart. Your silence speaks volumes about courage, resilience, and love. Tell your story so that others may learn what I have learned, that a voice is not necessary to be heard. With all my love, Harrison. Eleanor felt tears spill down her cheeks as she read. After all these years, Harrison still had the ability to move her to her core. She looked at him, this man who had seen her worth when she felt worthless, who had loved her not despite her silence but as the whole person she was. She pulled out her everyday notebook and wrote, "I love you more than any words could express, even if I could speak them. You are my heart." Harrison read the message and pulled her close. They sat together as the sky darkened and the stars emerged, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss in this spot. Eleanor thought about all the years between then and now, all the challenges overcome and joys celebrated. She had lost her voice to scarlet fever, but she had gained so much more. A husband who truly listened. Children who understood that communication came in many forms. A career that had impacted hundreds of students. A life full of meaning and purpose. As if reading her thoughts, Harrison said softly, "Your eyes told me everything I needed that day in the street. They told me you were strong and smart and beautiful. They told me you were worth knowing, worth loving. I have spent every day since learning the language of your eyes, and I have never regretted it for a moment." Eleanor kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. When they pulled apart, she wrote one more message. "Thank you for hearing me." "Always," Harrison said. "Always." They stayed until the moon rose high and full, bathing the desert in silver light. Then they packed up their things and drove home through the peaceful night, hand in hand, comfortable in their silence and in the love that needed no words. The years continued to unfold. Henry married his Emma and gave them grandchildren, 2 boys and a girl who called Eleanor grandmama and understood her silent communication just as their father had. Alice married a fellow teacher, a kind man named Robert, and they had children of their own. The twins grew into young men, Thomas studying to be a doctor and William taking over the management of a ranch outside town. Harrison and Eleanor aged together gracefully. Her hair turned silver, and his beard went fully white. They moved a bit slower, their joints creaking with arthritis, but their love remained strong. They still sat on their porch every evening, sharing their days. Harrison still brought her wildflowers when the desert bloomed. Eleanor still mended his clothes with careful, loving stitches. In 1905, as they approached their 30th wedding anniversary, Eleanor was inspired to write a second book, this one specifically about her life story. Using the journal Harrison had given her, she chronicled her journey from losing her voice to finding her purpose. She wrote about the fear and isolation of those first months after the scarlet fever, about the day she met Harrison, about building a life and family and career without spoken words. The book was published by the same company that had printed her teaching manual, and it found an enthusiastic audience. Letters poured in from people across the country who had been inspired by her story. Some were from people who themselves could not speak or had other disabilities. Others were from parents of such children. All of them thanked her for showing that a full, meaningful life was possible regardless of limitations. Eleanor was in her 60s by then, her teaching days behind her, but her impact still felt throughout Quartzsite and beyond. Former students would stop her on the street to thank her for the education she had given them. Young teachers would seek her advice on difficult students or challenging situations. She had become a respected elder in the community, her silence no longer seen as a deficit, but simply as part of who she was. On their 30th anniversary, their children threw them a grand celebration. The whole town seemed to turn out for the party held at the new community hall. There were speeches and toasts, stories shared about Harrison's years keeping the peace and Eleanor's innovations in education. Someone had even managed to track down Tom Brennan's daughter Sarah, who was now a grown woman with children of her own. She stood and spoke about how Eleanor had given her a love of reading that had shaped her entire life. As Eleanor sat beside Harrison at the head table, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, their friends and former students, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. This life, this full and rich and meaningful life, had been born from tragedy. The scarlet fever had taken her voice but had ultimately led her here to this moment, surrounded by love. Harrison leaned over and whispered in her ear, "What are you thinking?" Eleanor pulled out her ever-present notebook and wrote, "I am thinking that I am the luckiest woman alive." Harrison read it and smiled, that same warm smile that had captured her heart so many years ago. "I am the lucky one," he said. "I got to spend my life learning to hear you." They kissed, and the crowd cheered. Their children rolled their eyes good-naturedly at their parents' display of affection, but they were smiling too. The love between Harrison and Eleanor was legendary in Quartzsite, a story that parents told their children as an example of what true partnership looked like. As the years continued to pass, Harrison and Eleanor settled into a quiet retirement. They spent their days tending a small garden, reading together, and spoiling their growing number of grandchildren. They took walks through town, moving slowly but steadily, Harrison with his cane and Eleanor with her hand in his. The town around them continued to change. Quartzsite grew larger, more modern. Automobiles began to appear on the streets alongside horses. The railroad came through, connecting them more easily to the wider world. But the essential character of the place remained, that frontier spirit of resilience and community. Eleanor's health began to decline when she was 70. The doctors said her heart was weakening, worn out from a full life. She faced this final challenge with the same grace she had shown throughout her life. She made sure her affairs were in order, that her children understood her wishes, that her story was fully told in the books she had written. Harrison never left her side. He sat with her for hours, holding her hand, reading to her, simply being present. Their children visited frequently, bringing the grandchildren to see her. The house was full of love and laughter and tears as the family prepared to say goodbye. On a warm spring evening in 1911, Eleanor Langford Oakes passed away peacefully in her sleep, with Harrison lying beside her, his hand in hers. She was 70 years old and had lived a life far richer than she could have imagined in those dark days after losing her voice. Her funeral was one of the largest Quartzsite had ever seen. Former students came from as far as California to pay their respects. Fellow teachers spoke about her innovative methods and lasting influence. Her children and grandchildren shared memories of her love and wisdom. And Harrison, though shattered by grief, stood and spoke about the woman who had been his partner for more than 30 years. "Eleanor could not speak," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "But she was the most eloquent person I ever knew. She taught me that communication is not about words but about truly seeing and hearing each other. She taught me that love is shown in actions and glances and the quiet moments between heartbeats. She taught me that a limitation is not a dead end, but a different path to the same destination. I was blessed beyond measure to walk that path with her." He paused, wiping his eyes. "When I first met Eleanor, hiding behind a wagon while bullets flew, I looked into her eyes and I told her that they said everything I needed. That was true then, and it remained true every day we had together. Her eyes told me of her strength, her love, her hopes and dreams. I listened with my whole heart, and I heard everything. Harrison lived for 3 more years after Eleanor's death, years spent sharing stories about her with anyone who would listen. He visited her grave daily, telling her about the grandchildren's accomplishments, about changes in the town, about how much he missed her. When Harrison finally passed in 1914, he was buried beside Eleanor. Their shared headstone bore a simple inscription that captured the essence of their love: Harrison Oakes, 1851–1914, Eleanor Langford Oakes, 1841. 1911. Her eyes said everything he needed. His heart heard everything she said. Together, they spoke the language of love. Their children ensured that Eleanor's books remained in print, and her teaching methods continued to influence education for decades. The little school she had started in her parlor eventually grew into a specialized academy for children with various learning differences, named the Eleanor Oakes School in her honor. But perhaps her greatest legacy was the family she and Harrison had built together. Their descendants carried forward the lessons she had taught them. That communication happens in many ways, that limitations can be overcome with creativity and determination, and that love requires listening with more than just your ears. Years later, when Sarah Brennan was an old woman herself, she would tell her great-grandchildren about the silent teacher who had changed her life. "Mrs. Oakes could not speak," she would say, "but she taught me more about communication than anyone else ever did. She showed me that the most important things are not always said out loud. She taught me to pay attention, to really see people, to understand that everyone has their own way of expressing themselves." Was she sad? The children would ask. That she could not talk? "Sometimes, I think," Sarah would answer honestly. But she never let it stop her from living fully. And she had Sheriff Oakes, who loved her exactly as she was. He always said her eyes told him everything he needed, and watching them together, you could see it was true. They had their own language, made of looks and touches and written words. It was beautiful. And it was beautiful. The love story of Harrison and Eleanor Oakes became part of Quartzsite's history, a tale passed down through generations. It was a story about loss and resilience, about seeing beyond surface limitations, about the many ways humans can connect with each other. It was a story that reminded people that a voice, while valuable, is not necessary to be heard. That the deepest communication happens heart to heart, soul to soul. That true love means listening with everything you have, not just your ears. Eleanor had lost her voice to scarlet fever, but she had found something far more valuable. A love that needed no words, a purpose that transcended speech, a life that proved silence does not equal emptiness. With Harrison beside her, truly hearing her, she had spoken volumes. And her message echoed long after she was gone. That every person has value, every person can communicate, every person deserves to be truly seen and heard. In the end, Eleanor's silence had been her greatest teacher. It had forced her to find new ways to connect, new methods to share knowledge, new paths to love. It had stripped away the superficial and left only what was essential. And what was essential was this: the human heart's infinite capacity for adaptation, for connection, for love. Her eyes had said everything Harrison needed. His heart had heard everything she said. And together, they had created a love story for the ages, one that needed no voice to be heard loud and clear.